What if I told you that right now, today, in 2026, sitting members of Congress, national television hosts, and some of the most well-known political strategists in this country are openly debating whether the next American election is actually going to happen, not in a history class, not in a novel, right now, in real time. And here's the thing that really should stop you cold. One of the loudest Democratic voices in the entire House of Representatives just went live and pushed back on her own party's worst fears about this. But what she said instead of "don't worry about it" might genuinely be more alarming than the original question. You need to hear every single word of this. Do not go anywhere. And before we go 1 second further, if nobody in your life is sitting you down and having this conversation with you, that is exactly why this channel exists. Hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss what they don't want you to know. This is Nation Pulse, where we break down politics, government, and legislation so that everyday Americans can actually understand what is happening to their country. Welcome to the channel. Now let's get into it. All right. Let's start at the beginning because context is everything here. Rep. Jasmine Crockett is a Democratic Congresswoman from the state of Texas. She represents the 30th Congressional District, which covers parts of the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And over the last couple of years, she has become one of the most recognizable and outspoken Democratic voices in the entire House of Representatives. She is sharp, she is direct, she goes viral constantly, and she does not shy away from saying things that other politicians dance around. She's the kind of politician who will say what a lot of her colleagues are thinking but won't put on the record, which is exactly why what she said this week matters so much, because when Jasmine Crockett gets on a live stream and fields a direct question from a viewer, not a journalist, not a debate moderator, but an actual American citizen watching from home, and she gives a nuanced, careful, layered answer about the 2026 midterm elections, you pay attention. Because that answer tells you a lot about where we actually are as a country right now. So what happened? Let me walk you through it. Crockett was doing a YouTube live stream earlier this week. A viewer asked her directly, "Do you believe President Trump is planning to cancel the upcoming midterm elections?" Now, that is a loaded question. That is a question that if you'd asked someone 5 years ago, most Americans would have laughed at. Cancel the midterms? That's insane. That's not how America works. And you know what? For most of American history, they would have been right to laugh. But we are not living in most of American history right now. We are living in a moment where questions that once seemed unthinkable are being asked on national live streams by regular Americans sitting at home. And here is what Crockett said. She said she does not believe Trump will cancel the elections. But, and this is the critical but that most people are going to miss if they only read the headline, she laid out a very specific picture of what she does believe is going to happen. And that picture is not reassuring. She said, and I want to be precise here so I am not putting words in her mouth. She anticipates what she calls significant election interference. She talked about bogus litigation designed to gum up the works. She talked about the possibility of ICE officers being deployed near polling locations, not to enforce immigration law, but for the express purpose of intimidation, to make voters feel watched, to make voters feel afraid, to make certain communities feel like showing up to a polling place could lead to serious consequences for themselves or their families. Let that sink in for a second. A sitting member of the United States Congress is not warning you that the elections might be canceled. She is warning you that elections might be held under conditions designed to suppress who participates in them. And in some ways, I want you to think about this carefully, that might be the more effective playbook. Because if you cancel an election, you own it. Everyone can see it. The whole world reacts. But if you create an environment where certain people are too scared to vote, that's much harder to prove, much harder to fight. And the outcome can be just as decisive. Now, here is where this story gets really interesting, because Crockett was not just answering a random viewer question in a vacuum. She was essentially walking back a narrative that has been building on the left for months. Let's be real about this. There have been some very prominent voices, people on television, people with large platforms, who have been pushing the idea that Trump is actively planning to cancel or suspend the 2026 midterm elections entirely. Joy Behar on The View has claimed that Trump might be trying to declare martial law to prevent the midterms from happening, specifically pointing to protests around ICE enforcement as a potential trigger. Katie Couric, the veteran journalist and former Today Show anchor, has raised questions publicly about whether the Trump team might try to interfere with elections in ways that go far beyond normal political tactics. James Carville, the legendary Democratic strategist, the architect of Bill Clinton's 1992 presidential win, told a former CNN host that he is genuinely worried about Trump tampering with the 2026 midterms. These are not fringe voices. These are not people on some obscure podcast. These are mainstream figures with enormous audiences, and they have been putting this idea into the national conversation. And that has had an effect. If you spend any time on social media, you have seen the fear and the frustration from people who genuinely do not know what to believe. Is this a real threat? Is it media panic? Is the truth somewhere in the middle? What is actually happening? That is exactly what we are going to break down for you today, because you deserve a real answer, not a panic-inducing headline and not a dismissive, calm down, nothing to see here. Let's get into the mechanics of this, because this is where it really matters to understand how American government actually works. And I promise I'm going to make this as clear as I possibly can. Here is the foundational truth. Elections in the United States are not run by the federal government. They are not run by the president. They are not run by Congress. Under the Constitution and under longstanding law, elections, including federal elections, are administered at the state and local level. That means your state government, your county government, your city election boards, they manage voter registration, they set up the polling places, they train the poll workers, they count the votes. This is actually something Crockett herself acknowledged in her live stream. She said elections are largely controlled at the state and local level, and she is right about that. This was actually an intentional design choice by the founders of this country. They were worried about a central government having too much power over the mechanisms of democracy itself. So they dispersed that power. They spread it across 50 states, hundreds of counties, thousands of local jurisdictions. What that means practically is this. For a president to cancel a midterm election, he would need to convince or coerce enough governors, secretaries of state, and local election officials across enough states to simply not hold elections. And as Crockett pointed out, she does not believe Trump can get enough governors on board to make that happen. Even among Republican governors, many of whom support Trump's policy agenda, there is a very strong institutional incentive to protect the election process. Their own power depends on elections being held. Their own party's future depends on elections being held. Now, could Congress pass a law changing the date of federal elections? Technically, yes. Article 1 of the Constitution gives Congress the authority to set the time for choosing federal electors. But doing that would require a majority in the House and 60 votes in the Senate to overcome a filibuster. And even in a politically charged environment, doing something that dramatic, moving or canceling Election Day, would be the kind of move that triggers a constitutional crisis unlike anything this country has seen in the modern era. Courts would immediately get involved. Federal judges across the country would issue emergency injunctions. The Supreme Court would face pressure to rule. States would push back. And the political cost would be staggering, even for a politician with a high tolerance for political risk. So the bottom line on whether a president can simply cancel an election, the short answer is not without an almost unprecedented unraveling of the entire constitutional order. And while we are living in unusual times, we are not there yet. But here is where it gets more complicated. And this is the part of Crockett's answer that I really want to dig into, because I think it got lost in the headlines. Crockett did raise one specific scenario where she believes a suspension of elections could at least be argued, and that is if the current administration declared that the United States is under an active invasion. She connected this directly to Trump's consistent use of the word invasion to describe the situation at the southern border, and she raised a comparison that Trump himself made, calling Ukrainian President Zelensky a dictator for not holding elections during wartime, and noting that it's generally accepted that elections can be suspended when a nation is engaged in open warfare. Now, is the United States actually at war? No. Are we in a declared state of active military invasion? Legally? Constitutionally? No. But the concern Crockett is raising is about the weaponization of language and executive power. It's about whether the framing of a crisis, calling immigration an invasion, calling protests a national security threat, using emergency declarations as a tool of governance, could theoretically be stretched into a justification for extraordinary executive action. And this is not a completely hypothetical concern. We have already seen executive emergency powers used in ways that pushed right up against constitutional limits on multiple occasions by administrations of both parties over the last several decades. The question of where emergency powers end and executive overreach begins is one that courts have been arguing about for a long time. Crockett herself said she thinks it is more likely that the path chosen would be interference rather than outright cancellation, and she did not say she believes an invasion declaration to stop elections is coming. She was laying out a scenario, not making a prediction. But the fact that a sitting member of Congress felt it necessary to address the scenario at all tells you something about the temperature of the moment we're in. This is the part of the conversation where I think people's eyes glaze over, because election interference has become one of those phrases that gets thrown around so much that it starts to lose its meaning. So let's actually define it. Let's talk about what it looks like in practice. Because this is what Crockett is saying she genuinely expects to see. Not a cancellation, but interference. Election interference is any action taken with the intent of influencing or disrupting the democratic process in a way that undermines the free and fair expression of voter will. It can happen in a lot of different ways, and some of those ways are more visible than others. Voter intimidation is one form, and this is the specific mechanism Crockett raised when she talked about the possibility of ICE officers near polling locations. Federal and state laws prohibit intimidation, threats, or coercion of voters, but enforcement of those laws depends on political will, prosecutorial resources, and the speed of response. If voters in a particular community feel afraid to show up at the polls, the interference has already worked, even if no law was technically violated in a way that's easily provable in a courtroom. Litigation is another form. Crockett mentioned bogus litigation, and this is a tactic that has become increasingly sophisticated and common in American politics. The strategy is not always to win in court. Sometimes the strategy is to create enough legal uncertainty, enough chaos, enough delay that the process itself is disrupted. You file lawsuits challenging voter rolls, challenging mail-in ballot rules, challenging certification procedures. Even if you lose every single case, you've succeeded in creating doubt, slowing things down, and giving people reason to question the legitimacy of whatever outcome occurs. Then there's the broader ecosystem of information. The narratives about election integrity, the claims of fraud, the pressure on local election officials. Multiple election officials across the country have resigned in recent years, citing harassment and threats. When the people responsible for running elections at the county level quit because the job has become too dangerous, who fills those roles? And do the replacements have the same commitment to neutral professional administration? These are the real questions, and they are questions that don't have easy, clean answers. Let's zoom out for a second, because I think it's important to ask, why is this conversation even happening? Why are Americans not just political junkies, not just cable news watchers, but regular people sending questions to their Congresswoman during a YouTube live stream? Why are they asking whether their elections are going to happen? Part of the answer is the information environment we're all living in. Social media algorithms reward fear and outrage. Cable news ratings go up when people are anxious. And so there is a genuine financial incentive for content creators, television hosts, and political operatives on all sides to amplify the most alarming possible interpretation of every event. Not because it's always the most accurate interpretation, but because alarm keeps people watching, clicking, and engaged. Part of the answer is that norms that people once took for granted have been tested in ways they hadn't been tested before. The peaceful transfer of power, something that Americans had watched happen every 4 years like clockwork for over 2 centuries, became a contested and violent event on January 6th, 2021. When something that fundamental gets cracked, even partially, it sends a psychological signal to millions of people. Things we thought were certain are not as certain as we believed. And once that signal gets sent, it's very hard to unsend. And part of the answer is that there are real, documented, ongoing efforts to reshape how elections work in this country. Some of those efforts are legal and represent one side of a legitimate policy debate. Some of them push up against or cross legal lines. Sorting out which is which requires exactly the kind of engaged, informed citizenry that channels like this one are trying to help build. Because here's the truth. Democracy does not run on autopilot. It never has. It requires citizens who pay attention, citizens who show up, citizens who understand the rules well enough to know when the rules are being bent, citizens who don't just consume headlines, but actually want to understand what is happening beneath the headline. That is you. That is why you're watching this video right now. Let me give you the actual legal framework here, because I want you to leave this video armed with facts, not just feelings. The dates for congressional elections are established by federal law. Since 1845, federal law has set Election Day as the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. That law was passed by Congress and can be changed by Congress, but again, that requires legislative action through both chambers, not a unilateral presidential decision. The Constitution itself, in Article 1, Section 4, says that Congress has the authority to set the time, place, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives. The states have authority to regulate the actual conduct of those elections within their borders. The president has no direct constitutional authority over the scheduling or conduct of congressional elections. Presidential emergency powers are governed primarily by the National Emergencies Act of 1976, which allows the president to declare national emergencies and access certain statutory powers. But those powers do not include the authority to suspend congressional elections. There is no statute on the books that grants a president that authority under any emergency declaration. For elections to be stopped, you would need either an act of Congress, a Supreme Court ruling, or a complete breakdown of state and local government structures across enough states to prevent voting from being organized. None of those things look imminent based on any credible legal analysis right now. Does that mean there is nothing to watch? No. Vigilance is always warranted. The system has protections, but protections only work if people are paying attention and willing to enforce them. That is the real takeaway. Okay, we've been through a lot. Let's bring this home with something practical, because the last thing I want is for you to walk away from this video feeling more helpless or more panicked than when you started watching. That is not what Nation Pulse is about. We are about giving you real information you can actually use. So here is what every American who cares about the 2026 midterms should be doing right now. First, know your state's voting rules. Voting laws vary significantly from state to state, and many of them have changed in recent years. Voter ID requirements, mail-in voting rules, early voting windows, registration deadlines, all of this differs depending on where you live. Go to your state's official Secretary of State website and read the actual rules. Do this now, months before the election, not the week before. Second, register to vote if you haven't, and verify your registration if you have. Voter rolls are purged regularly in many states. People who registered years ago and haven't voted in recent cycles sometimes find out on election day that they are no longer on the rolls. This is legal under certain circumstances. The solution is to verify your registration well in advance. Third, actually show up. I know this sounds too simple, but it is the single most important thing any individual American can do. Voter turnout in midterm elections is historically much lower than in presidential election years, and the decisions made by Congress in midterm elections shape everything, from budgets to legislation to oversight of the executive branch. Every vote in every congressional race matters. Fourth, pay attention to local election officials, the county clerks, the registrars, the election boards. These are the people who actually run elections. Know who they are in your community. Pay attention to whether they are facing political pressure or harassment. And if you are so inclined, consider volunteering as a poll worker. Election administration desperately needs civic-minded people willing to work. Fifth, be a critical consumer of information. When you see a headline claiming that elections are about to be canceled, or that the election was rigged, or that some dramatic thing is happening, pause. Find the primary source. Read the actual quote. Watch the actual video. Understand who is saying what and in what context. The difference between Trump might declare elections canceled and a Congresswoman says she doesn't anticipate that but does fear interference is enormous, and that difference matters. So where does all of this leave us with what Jasmine Crockett actually said? I think her statement is actually more nuanced and in some ways more honest than either the Trump is going to cancel everything camp or the nothing to see here, stop being dramatic camp. She is a sitting member of Congress with access to information and context that most Americans don't have. She said she is not anticipating a cancellation and gave specific structural reasons why. The decentralized nature of elections, the role of state governments, the requirement that he'd need enough governors to go along with something that dramatic. She wasn't just saying calm down, she was explaining why. At the same time, she was clear-eyed and explicit about the things she does anticipate. She is worried about a legal strategy designed to create chaos and doubt. She is worried about enforcement actions being used as tools of intimidation near polling places. She is watching the language around invasion and emergency powers and what that language might be building toward. That is not panic. That is watchfulness. And watchfulness is exactly the right posture for any informed citizen heading into an election year. The 2026 midterms are coming. They are scheduled. The legal and constitutional architecture of this country strongly supports them happening. But the quality, the fairness, and the accessibility of those elections is something that depends on engaged Americans who refuse to look away. People who stay informed, people who show up, people who do not let complexity become an excuse for disengagement. That is the pulse of this nation, and that is why you're here. Here is the bottom line from everything we covered today. The 2026 midterm elections are not canceled. They are not currently being canceled. The president does not have the unilateral constitutional authority to cancel them, but the conversation happening around these elections, the fears about interference, intimidation, litigation, and the use of emergency rhetoric is not noise. It is signal. It is a signal that the health of American democracy is something that requires active, informed citizens, not just every 4 years for a presidential race, but in every election at every level, every single time. Jasmine Crockett did not tell Americans to relax. She told them to watch carefully. And honestly, that's the right message. Now, here is what I need from you right now. 3 things. 1, if this video gave you real information, if it helped you understand something more clearly than you did 20 minutes ago, hit that like button. It takes 2 seconds, and it means the world for getting this content in front of more people who need to hear it. 2, subscribe to Nation Pulse if you haven't already. We are here every week breaking down what is actually happening in Washington, in your state legislatures, in the bills that affect your daily life, in language that actually makes sense. You don't need a law degree. You don't need a political science background. You just need to want to know, and we will tell you. 3, share this video. Put it in a group chat. Send it to a family member who is confused about what's happening. Post it on your socials. Because the more Americans who actually understand how elections work, how the Constitution distributes power, and what the real threats and the real safeguards look like, the stronger this democracy gets. Full stop. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I want to know, are you worried about the 2026 midterms? What questions do you have about how elections work in your state? What topics do you want Nation Pulse to break down next? Let's keep this conversation going. This is Nation Pulse. I'll see you in the next one.